The signal came on a Tuesday. Not that the day of the week mattered much anymore, not after the Vorith fleet had settled into low Earth orbit like a storm cloud made of steel and malice, their ships so massive they blotted out portions of the sky the way mountains blotted out horizons. People in Tokyo looked up and saw the shadow of a vessel 3 times the size of their entire city drifting silently overhead, its surface studded with weapons arrays that hummed with a frequency that made teeth ache and windows rattle. Children in Mumbai pressed their faces against glass and watched the alien warships hang there like terrible ornaments, their bioluminescent hull markings pulsing in rhythms that scientists scrambling in underground bunkers would later determine were actually a form of laughter. The Vorith were laughing. They had been laughing since the moment they dropped out of faster-than-light travel and positioned themselves above humanity's fragile blue world, because to them, this entire situation was nothing more than a formality, a routine acquisition. They had done this 437 times before, across 437 worlds, and not once had the process taken longer than 72 hours from first contact to complete submission. The Vorith were not conquerors in the passionate, violent sense that humans understood conquest. They were more like a corporation processing a buyout, efficient and cold and utterly convinced of the outcome before the first meeting was ever called. Admiral Chen Wei stood in the Global Defense Command Center buried 300 meters beneath Geneva, Switzerland, and stared at the holographic display that showed every Vorith vessel currently in Earth's orbital space. There were 412 of them. Her analysts had counted 3 times, hoping the number would shrink, but it stubbornly refused to cooperate. 412 ships ranging from Scout-class vessels the size of football stadiums to the 3 Dominion-class flagships that were each comparable in mass to a small moon. Behind her, 47 of the world's top military minds sat in tiered rows, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of tactical screens, their expressions cycling between professional composure and the very human, very understandable urge to panic. Chen Wei did not allow herself either luxury. She had been preparing for something like this for 11 years, ever since the Fermi Array had picked up the first directional signal from what would eventually be identified as the Vorith Advanced Scout. 11 years of preparation, and now the clock above the main display read 68 hours and counting, because that was how long the Vorith transmission had given humanity to respond with unconditional surrender before the orbital bombardment would begin. The transmission itself had been almost insultingly brief. The Vorith communication drone had descended into the upper atmosphere and broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, in a language that humanity's artificial intelligence systems had cracked within 4 minutes because the Vorith had deliberately engineered it to be simple, the way you might speak slowly and use small words when addressing someone you consider to not be very bright. The message said, in essence, that Earth had been selected for integration into the Vorith collective, that resistance was statistically futile based on the military capability assessments the Vorith had conducted during their approach, that humanity would be permitted to continue existing as a labor and resource class within the collective's economic framework, and that any attempt at armed resistance would result in the complete sterilization of the planetary surface, after which the Vorith would simply import a more cooperative species to manage the resource extraction. It was not a declaration of war. It was a terms of service agreement, and humanity was expected to click accept within 68 hours or face deletion. What the Vorith did not know, and what made Chen Wei allow herself exactly one small, tight smile before returning to her work, was that humanity had been doing something very specific during those 11 years of preparation. Something the Vorith's long-range assessments had completely failed to account for, because the Vorith evaluated civilizations based on their observable military technology, their energy output signatures, their population density and resource consumption, all the metrics that had proven reliable across 437 previous conquests. What the Vorith could not measure, what their instruments had no calibration for, was the peculiar and frankly alarming way that humans responded to existential pressure. Every other species the Vorith had encountered had, when faced with the overwhelming mathematical reality of their situation, made the rational choice. They had surrendered. They had calculated the odds and determined that survival under subjugation was preferable to extinction through defiance. It was logical. It was sensible. It was, by every reasonable metric, the correct decision. Humans, Chen Wei had argued in front of the United Earth Council 11 years ago with a presentation that had left several representatives quietly weeping, were not reasonable in that particular way. Humans had a long, exhaustive, and frankly disturbing history of being told something was impossible and then doing it anyway out of pure spite. The 68-hour clock ticked down and humanity did not surrender. Instead, humanity went to work. The first thing that the Vorith noticed, approximately 6 hours after their ultimatum had been delivered, was unusual electromagnetic activity in 17 locations across Earth's northern hemisphere. Their instruments identified the signatures as consistent with large-scale industrial manufacturing, which was curious but not alarming. Perhaps the primitives were attempting to construct some form of defense system, which the Vorith tactical AI rated as ineffective with a confidence level of 99.7%. The Vorith commander, a being called Overlord Crothvel who had personally overseen the acquisition of 62 worlds and who wore his victories as bioluminescent tattoos across his exoskeleton, reviewed the report and dismissed it. Let them build their toys, he communicated to his fleet commanders through the collective's neural link. It would change nothing. It never changed anything. He returned his attention to the administrative paperwork involved in processing a new acquisition, because there was always a great deal of paperwork, and the collective's bureaucratic requirements were extensive even by galactic standards. What Crothvel's instruments were detecting was not a defense system in any sense the Vorith would have recognized. The 17 locations were the final activation sites of Project Underlord, a program that had consumed more collective human resources than any endeavor in history, dwarfing the Manhattan Project, the Apollo program, and the global renewable energy transition combined. For 11 years, working in the deepest classified secrecy that a fractious, argumentative, gloriously ungovernable species could manage, humanity's finest engineers, physicists, mathematicians, and what could only be described as professional lunatics had been building something extraordinary. They had been building it in pieces, distributed across the planet, each component appearing to be something entirely mundane to any outside observer, because humans had learned from their own history that the most dangerous projects were the ones that nobody could identify until it was far too late to stop them. The 17 sites were the power generation nodes for a system that had no name in any public document, referred to only in the most classified channels by a designation that had been chosen by the project's lead engineer, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a woman who had spent 30 years studying alien signal intercepts and who had a very particular sense of humor about the whole situation. She called it the grandfather paradox. Not because it had anything to do with time travel, but because its entire operational purpose was to make the Vorith wish they had never been born. 32 hours into the countdown, Overlord Crothvel received his first genuinely unexpected report. One of his forward scout vessels, positioned in low Earth orbit to monitor surface activity, had gone silent. Not been destroyed, not malfunctioning, simply gone silent, its transponder signal cutting off so cleanly and completely that it took the fleet's communication system several minutes to even register it as an anomaly rather than a scheduled maintenance pause. Crothvel ordered 2 additional scouts to investigate, a standard protocol response, and those 2 scouts also went silent within minutes of approaching the last known position of the first. He stared at the display showing 3 missing vessels and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, an emotion his species called Vorith, which translated roughly as the unsettling sensation that something unexpected is happening and you do not yet have enough information to understand what it is. Crothvel had not felt Vorith since his 41st conquest, when an ocean-dwelling species had surprised his landing parties with a sonic weapon that had never shown up in any of his pre-invasion scans. He had solved that problem by simply sterilizing the oceans first. He filed a note to consider similar protocols here, ordered a full sensor sweep of the region where his scouts had vanished and waited. The sensor sweep found nothing. No debris, no energy signatures, no indication that 3 warships had ever occupied that space. They had simply ceased to exist, and whatever had caused that cessation had done so without producing any detectable secondary effects whatsoever. This was, by any technical assessment, impossible. The laws of physics were quite firm on the subject of large metallic objects not simply vanishing without releasing energy. Crothvel called his chief science officer, a Vorith specialist named Assessor Directun, who reviewed the sensor data with the particular expression of someone encountering information that refuses to cooperate with their existing understanding of reality. The assessor ran the analysis twice, then a third time, then sat quietly for a moment before delivering his report. The ships, he said, appeared to have been removed from the local space-time continuum via a mechanism that did not correspond to any known physical phenomenon catalogued in the collective's database of 437 surveyed civilizations. What he meant, translated from the careful diplomatic language of a scientist speaking to a commander who did not enjoy being told inconvenient things, was that something on that primitive blue planet had done something that should not have been possible, and he had absolutely no idea what it was or how to defend against it. Crothwell increased the countdown's response requirement. Humanity now had 30 hours to surrender, not 68. He was not alarmed, he told himself firmly. He was being efficient. There was no reason to extend unnecessary time to a species that was clearly attempting some form of technological interference. He broadcast the updated ultimatum, and humanity's response came back within minutes. Not a surrender. Not even a negotiation. What came back was a single audio file that, when played through the fleet's translation systems, turned out to be an ancient human piece of music from a composer named Johann Sebastian Bach, specifically the piece known as Toccata and Fugue in D minor, which has a very dramatic opening that humans have historically associated with impending doom, and which someone in the Global Defense Command Center had apparently decided was the perfect reply to a hostile alien empire reducing the surrender deadline. Someone had also appended a 17-second audio clip that the translation AI identified as human laughter, specifically the kind that sounds completely unhinged. In the bunker beneath Geneva, Chinwei allowed herself a second smile, slightly less tight than the first. The music had been Dr. Tanaka's idea. The laughter had been contributed by General Marcus Okafor, former commander of the African Strategic Defense Network, a man who had once held a defensive line for 19 days with a force a quarter the size of the attacking army and who had reportedly spent most of those 19 days in an excellent mood. Okafor was standing next to Chen Wei now, studying the Vorath fleet disposition on the holographic display with the expression of a chess player who has already seen 17 moves ahead and is simply waiting for his opponent to make the move that will make everything obvious. They've repositioned 2 of the Dominion-class ships, he said, pointing to the display. They're nervous. Chen Wei nodded. She had seen it too. The massive flagships had shifted their orbital positions in a way that looked like a tactical adjustment but was actually, according to Dr. Tanaka's behavioral analysis team, a stress response. The Vorath moved their largest ships closer together when they were uncertain, an instinctive clustering behavior that went back to their pre-technological herd ancestry. They were clustering. Good. Clustering was exactly what humanity needed them to do. 22 hours before the deadline, the Vorath lost another 11 ships. This time there was no clean disappearance. This time the 11 ships experienced what Assessor Derek Tun would later describe in his report, assuming he survived long enough to write one, as spontaneous systemic failure across all primary and secondary systems simultaneously, their power cores simply shutting down as if someone had reached into the fundamental architecture of their technology and removed a load-bearing concept. The ships did not explode. They did not drift. They sat in orbit like enormous, powerless husks, their crews suddenly surrounded by darkness and silence, the vital hum of Vorath engineering replaced by nothing. Emergency broadcast signals began transmitting from all 11 vessels, their crews calling for assistance, and those signals were picked up not only by the rest of the Vorath fleet but also by humanity's deep space listening arrays, which fed the data directly to Dr. Tanaka's team for analysis. What Tanaka's team was looking for was confirmation that the grandfather paradox was performing at expected parameters, and what they found when they processed the Vorath emergency signals was better than expected. Significantly better. Tanaka looked at the readouts, then looked at her senior engineer, Dr. Priya Vasquez, and said in the careful, measured tone of someone trying very hard not to shout, that they needed to brief Admiral Chen Wei immediately. The briefing happened in a small side room off the main command center, with exactly 6 people present, because what Tanaka had to say was not something she wanted recorded in the main system's logs quite yet. She stood in front of a wall display showing energy readings from the Vorath fleet and spoke in her characteristic precise, unhurried way, as if the information she was delivering was perfectly ordinary and not, in fact, the kind of thing that would change the entire course of the conflict. What she told them was this: the grandfather paradox was not just working. It was working better than the most optimistic models had projected, because the Vorath technology, despite being centuries more advanced than anything humanity had independently developed, had a vulnerability that none of the Vorath's 437 previous conquests had ever been in a position to exploit. The Vorath collective operated on a unified technological architecture. Every piece of Vorath technology, from a personal communication device to a Dominion-class flagship, operated using the same fundamental operating principles, the same base-level physical constants that Vorath engineering had been built around for 3,000 years. It was extraordinarily efficient. It was the product of a civilization that had been dominant for so long it had never needed to diversify its technological foundations. It was, Tanaka said, looking around the room at 6 people who were beginning to understand what she was telling them, essentially the same as a massive corporation that had run the same software system for 3,000 years without ever needing to update it, because no competitor had ever been in a position to exploit its weaknesses. The grandfather paradox had found the weakness. Specifically, it had identified the particular manipulation of quantum-level physical constants that Vorath technology was dependent upon and was demonstrating, in a highly localized and targeted fashion, what happened when those constants were interfered with. What happened, as the 11 drifting powerless ships demonstrated, was that Vorath technology stopped working. Not gradually. Not partially. Completely and immediately, like a light being switched off. Crothwell received Directon's emergency analysis and sat with it for a long moment in his command chamber, the room that had never once in 62 conquests felt anything less than absolutely secure. The room felt different now. He reviewed the assessor's conclusions, the same conclusions that Admiral Chinwei was receiving from Dr. Tanaka, though from the opposite side of the equation, and he felt Vorath again, but stronger this time, different, more like its adjacent emotion in the Vorath experiential vocabulary, a word that had no clean human translation but meant roughly the specific dread of realizing that the prey you came to hunt has been watching you and preparing for you for a very long time and you have only just understood this. He looked at his fleet disposition. 412 ships. Minus 14 now, minus the ones he could no longer account for. He looked at the blue planet below, its cloud patterns serene and indifferent, its oceans catching the light of its star in shifting patterns of silver and blue. He thought about the signal his intelligence teams had intercepted 11 years ago, the brief Vorath scout report that had flagged this system as an emerging civilization of minimal threat potential. Minimal threat potential. He thought about those 3 words for exactly the length of time it took for his communication officer to inform him that the planet's surface was showing energy output signatures consistent with an escalation of whatever system had disabled his ships. Then he stopped thinking about the scout report and started thinking about something else entirely. He started thinking about whether 62 conquests were, perhaps, quite enough. But thinking was a luxury and the countdown was still running, and in the bunker beneath Geneva, Marcus Okafor was saying something to Chinwei with the quiet certainty of a man who had waited 19 days before and knew exactly what waiting could do. He was saying that the Vorath were going to make a decision in the next few hours, and that the decision would tell humanity everything it needed to know about whether this ended cleanly or became something longer and harder and more expensive than anyone wanted. He was saying that they needed to be ready for both possibilities because the one thing you could never afford to do in any conflict was assume your enemy was going to be sensible. Chinwei listened to him and looked at the display showing the Vorath fleet, those hundreds of ships hanging in the dark above her world, and thought about 437 civilizations that had looked up at those same ships and made what the Vorath considered the rational choice. She thought about what it meant that humanity had spent 11 years not making the rational choice. She thought about Dr. Tanaka's numbers, about the grandfather paradox humming in its 17 locations across the planet, about what the next 18 hours were going to look like if Crothwell decided to stop doing paperwork and start doing something desperate. Then she turned back to her work because there was still a great deal of it to do, and the universe was very much watching, and humanity, as it had always done in its strange, stubborn, magnificent way, was just getting started. The clock read 18 hours and 12 minutes. Below the Vorath fleet, 8 billion humans went about the business of preparing for what came next, because surrendering had never really been on the table and everyone, on both sides of the orbital divide, was beginning to understand that. The 18-hour mark came and went like a held breath finally released. Overlord Crothwell made his decision at the 16-hour mark, which was 4 hours earlier than Chinwei's predictive models had estimated, which told her 2 important things simultaneously. First, that the Vorath commander was more rattled than their behavioral analysis team had projected. Second, and considerably more concerning, that rattled commanders with 412 warships and a 3,000-year history of unchallenged dominance did not become cautious when they were frightened. They became aggressive. It was, Chinwei reflected as the alert klaxons began their measured, urgent rhythm through the Geneva bunker, a remarkably human response for an alien species that had spent 3 millennia convincing itself it was nothing like the primitive civilizations it consumed. Crothwell ordered a full orbital bombardment of 17 specific surface coordinates that his intelligence teams had spent the past 30 hours identifying as the probable locations of whatever system was disabling his ships. He had done the math, or rather his tactical AI had done the math, and the conclusion was straightforward. Destroy the weapon before it destroyed the fleet. It was not elegant. It was not the careful, administrative conquest he preferred. But 62 previous victories had also taught him that when something unexpected appeared, you removed it with overwhelming force and returned to the paperwork afterward. He gave the order with the particular calm of someone who has decided that a problem can be solved by making it cease to exist, and 206 Vorith warships rotated their primary weapon arrays toward the 17 surface targets and began charging their bombardment systems. What happened next took 11.3 seconds, and those 11.3 seconds were, by any reasonable historical assessment, the most consequential 11 seconds in the history of not just humanity but of a significant portion of the known galaxy. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had been awake for 41 hours when the bombardment order was detected by the Grandfather Paradox's early warning integration system, a component of the project that she had personally designed and that she had privately referred to, in the notebooks she kept in a thoroughly non-classified personal journal, as the tripwire. The tripwire was not a weapon. It was a sensor array of extraordinary sensitivity, woven through the upper atmosphere via a network of what had appeared to external observers to be standard weather monitoring satellites, which had been launched over 7 years in batches small enough to avoid triggering the Vorith fleet's interest. The tripwire's sole function was to detect the specific energy signature produced by Vorith weapon systems entering their final charging phase, a signature that Tanaka's team had reverse-engineered from the data collected during the 3 missing scout ships and the 11 disabled vessels. When the tripwire registered 206 simultaneous weapon charging signatures, it did not send an alert to a human operator. There was no time for a human operator. Instead, it sent a direct activation signal to the Grandfather Paradox's primary response protocol, a protocol that Tanaka had coded herself over 3 sleepless weeks 18 months ago, and which she had named, with characteristic dry humor, the checkmate subroutine. The checkmate subroutine did several things in a very specific sequence, and it did them in the 11.3 seconds between the Vorith weapons reaching 70% charge and the point at which they would have fired. The first thing it did was activate the Grandfather Paradox at full operational capacity across all 17 nodes simultaneously, something the system had not yet done, having previously been operating at between 12 and 23% capacity for the targeted disruptions that had disabled the 14 ships. Full operational capacity was a different thing entirely. Full operational capacity meant that the quantum-level interference field that the Grandfather Paradox generated was no longer localized and targeted. It expanded rapidly and precisely, in a carefully calculated geometric pattern that Tanaka's team had spent 4 years modeling, spreading outward from the 17 surface nodes in an interlocking web that covered, within 8 seconds, the entire volume of space occupied by the Vorith fleet. Every Vorith vessel in Earth's orbital space, all 398 remaining ships, experienced the same thing that the 11 disabled vessels had experienced, the same complete and instantaneous shutdown of every system dependent on the technological architecture that Vorith engineering had been built upon for 3,000 years. Power cores went dark. Weapon arrays, charged to 70% and now with nothing to complete the firing sequence, simply stopped. Navigation systems, communication arrays, life support management AIs, all of it ceased in the same moment, as if the universe itself had grown briefly tired of Vorith technology and decided to take a break from supporting it. 398 Vorith warships went dark in the span of 8 seconds. In the Geneva bunker, nobody spoke for a full 4 seconds after the display updated. The holographic representation of the Vorith fleet, which had been showing the terrifying red indicators of charging weapon systems, was now showing something that the display's designers had not originally anticipated needing a color code for, because the possibility had existed only in the optimistic tail of the probability distribution that most of the planning team had privately considered too good to model seriously. Every ship indicator had shifted to a pale, flat gray, the system's default representation for an object that was present and detectable but producing no active energy signatures whatsoever. 398 gray dots hung in the holographic space above a small blue sphere, silent and still as stones. General Marcus Okafor broke the silence first, which was appropriate, because he had been waiting for this specific moment for 11 years and had earned the right to say something memorable. What he said was not memorable in the traditional sense. What he said was, quietly and with complete sincerity, "There they are." Then he picked up his command headset and began issuing orders, because there was a very great deal to do and the window for doing it was not infinite. Crothwell sat in complete darkness in his command chamber and experienced something that his species had not genuinely experienced in recorded history. Not Vorith, not its stronger cousin, but something beyond both of them, something the Vorith language did not actually have a word for because it had never needed one. He sat in the dark and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only from having all other possibilities systematically removed, that he had made an error. Not a tactical error, not a strategic error, but a categorical one, the kind that invalidated not just a decision but an entire framework of understanding. He had looked at humanity's technology and seen primitives. He had looked at humanity's history of conflict and seen chaos and inefficiency. He had looked at humanity's fractious, argumentative, endlessly complicated civilization and seen weakness. He had been looking at the wrong things. In the dark of his dead flagship, surrounded by the sounds of his crew moving carefully in zero gravity, calling to each other in the clipped, controlled tones of Vorith military discipline, Hrothvel began to understand what he had actually been looking at for the past 68 hours. He had been looking at a species that had spent 11 years learning everything it could about an enemy it had never met, building a weapon it had never tested against a threat it could not yet fully measure, and then waited with what he was now forced to recognize as extraordinary patience for exactly the right moment to use it. He thought about the Bach music. He thought about the laughter. He thought about the fact that humanity had responded to an extinction-level ultimatum with what was essentially a joke, and he understood now that it had not been bravado. It had been confidence. There was a very significant difference between those two things, and Hrothvel had spent 62 conquests encountering the first and had just discovered, in the most instructive possible way, what the second one looked like. The second thing the checkmate subroutine did, after activating the full grandfather paradox field, was launch humanity's orbital response fleet. This was the part of the plan that had been the most contentious in the 11 years of preparation, the element that had generated the most argument, the most doubt, and the most heated closed-door sessions in the United Earth Council chambers. Because building a system to disable alien technology was one thing. It was defensive, it was reactive, it addressed the immediate problem of 412 warships in orbit above your planet. But the grandfather paradox's checkmate subroutine had not been designed to stop at disabling the Vorith fleet. It had been designed by Yuki Tanaka and argued for, fiercely and persistently and with a level of strategic vision that had eventually convinced even the most cautious members of the council, as the first phase of something considerably larger. The argument Tanaka had made 11 years ago and repeatedly since, was this: disabling an invasion fleet solved the immediate problem but created a different one. A wounded empire did not become a peaceful neighbor. A wounded empire came back, and it came back having studied what hurt it and prepared for it. The Vorith Collective was 400 star systems, 3,000 years of technological development, and a military infrastructure that humanity could not match in raw numbers regardless of what clever systems it built. Stopping this fleet was necessary. Stopping the next fleet and the fleet after that and the one after that required something more. It required changing the fundamental equation of the relationship between humanity and the Vorith Collective in a way that could not be undone by simply sending more ships. It required, Tanaka had said, looking at the United Earth Council with the steady gaze of someone who has already decided what they believe and is waiting for everyone else to catch up, going on offense. The orbital response fleet had been built in the same 11 years, in the same distributed, compartmentalized, carefully hidden way as the grandfather paradox, and it was not large. Humanity did not have the industrial capacity to build a fleet comparable in size to what the Vorith had brought to Earth's orbit. What humanity had instead was something that Tanaka and the fleet's chief designer, Admiral Yusuf Hassan, had spent considerable time calibrating to a very specific purpose. The fleet consisted of 44 vessels, each one roughly comparable in size to a mid-range Vorith warship, each one built around a miniaturized grandfather paradox emitter that could project a localized disruption field, and each one crewed by people who had spent 11 years training for a mission that most of them had privately wondered if they would ever actually fly. When the checkmate subroutine triggered their launch sequence, those 44 ships rose from concealed facilities on 6 continents, punched through the atmosphere in a coordinated ascent that took 11 minutes from hangar to orbit, and spread out through the suddenly silent Vorith fleet like chess pieces being placed on a board by someone who had memorized every possible response to every possible countermove. The Vorith crews, working by emergency light in powerless ships, became aware of the human vessels moving through their formation with a gradual, creeping comprehension that was, for many of them, deeply disorienting. They had come here expecting submission. They were floating in dead ships watching smaller, unfamiliar vessels navigate their formation with an ease that suggested the humans had studied the fleet disposition carefully and knew exactly where they were going. Which was accurate. Humanity's 44 ships were not there to destroy the Vorith fleet. They were there to do something more specific and considerably more strategic. They were there to board 18 carefully selected vessels, specifically the 3 Dominion-class flagships and 15 of the largest cruiser-class ships, secure them and take them intact. Because a dead Vorith fleet was a statement. An intact, captured Vorith fleet, including 3 Dominion-class flagships, was something else entirely. It was a resource. It was a message. It was leverage of a kind that nothing else humanity could have done would have produced. Chen Wei watched the boarding operation from the Geneva bunker, tracking the 44 ships on the holographic display, watching the status indicators update as each boarding team made contact with its target vessel. The operation had been planned in extraordinary detail because the Vorith, even without powered systems, were a physically formidable species, averaging 2.3 meters in height, possessed of an exoskeletal structure that made them substantially more resistant to physical force than a human of comparable size, and trained in a military tradition that did not recognize the concept of surrender to a species they had classified as primitive. The boarding teams were not expecting a peaceful reception. They were equipped accordingly with technology that did not depend on any of the principles the grandfather paradox was currently disrupting, specifically designed for close-quarters operations against a physically superior opponent in zero-gravity and low-light conditions. The teams were small, fast, and had been selected from every major military tradition humanity possessed, a deliberate choice by Okafor, who had argued that a species as diverse in its fighting traditions as humanity should bring all of those traditions to bear simultaneously rather than standardizing to any single approach. What the Vorith encountered when the boarding teams came through their airlocks was not a uniform military force. It was something far more confusing, adaptable, and relentless, people who had trained together long enough to function as a unit but who brought to that unit a breadth of tactical creativity that the Vorith's standardized military doctrine had no prepared response for. Flagship after flagship reported contact. The fighting inside the dead ships was close and difficult and exactly as hard as the planning team had anticipated, but it moved in humanity's direction with a momentum that, once established, proved impossible to reverse. The Vorith were formidable. Humanity was prepared, motivated, operating with a particular focused intensity of people defending their home, and in possession of one additional advantage that the operational planners had quietly considered their most important asymmetric asset. The Vorith crews were in the dark, disoriented, cut off from the neural communication network that connected every member of the collective and that they had never in their lives operated without. The neural link was as fundamental to Vorith military function as their weapons, their ships, and their training. Without it, they were not just isolated individuals. They were individuals experiencing something their psychology had no framework for, a silence in the place where community and shared awareness had always been, a disconnection that was as much psychological as tactical. They were fighting well because Vorith soldiers always fought well, but they were fighting scared, in a way they did not have the individual vocabulary to process, and that mattered enormously in the long run of a close-quarters engagement. Crothwell was on the 14th deck of his flagship when the human boarding team reached him, and the account of what happened next would be replicated, analyzed, and debated in military academies for generations. The Vorith commander had gathered 30 of his personal guard around him, the finest soldiers in his fleet, and they had formed a defensive position in the flagship's primary command corridor with the disciplined efficiency of warriors who had trained for exactly this kind of last-stand scenario. The human boarding team that reached them was 14 people, led by a captain named Esperanza Vidal, a woman from Montevideo who had spent 11 years training for this specific moment and who had, according to her teammates, spent most of those 11 years being the calmest person in any given room. Vidal assessed the defensive position, the 30 armored Vorith soldiers in a corridor designed for their species and not for her team, the closed blast doors behind them, the emergency lighting casting everything in deep red shadow, and she did something that the Vorith tactical doctrine had no classification for. She stopped her team 40 meters from the Vorith position, sat down cross-legged on the corridor floor and began to talk. Not in any human language. In Vorith, specifically in the formal register used for communications between commanders of equivalent rank, a language her team's translator technology rendered accurately and immediately, because 11 years was a long time to prepare and language had been one of the first priorities. She talked for 6 minutes. What she said was not a demand for surrender and not a threat and not a recitation of military terms. What she said, in precise and carefully structured Vorith formal register, was a summary of the current tactical situation that Crothwell already knew, followed by an offer that the Vorith collective had never once made to any of the 437 civilizations it had absorbed, because it had never needed to negotiate from anything other than a position of absolute strength. Vidal offered Crothwell and his fleet crews safe return to Vorith space, unharmed and unimpeded, in exchange for the 18 vessels humanity had already designated for capture and for a formal communication to the Vorith Collective High Command from Crothwell himself, delivered in his capacity as fleet commander and carrying his full authority, recommending that the collective reconsider its assessment of Earth's status within the galactic framework. She did not say that humanity wanted to be left alone, because that was not actually what the plan called for. What she said, with the careful precision of someone delivering a message that had been written and rewritten over many months by some of the best strategic minds humanity possessed, was that humanity was interested in a different kind of relationship with the Vorith Collective. Not as a subject civilization. Not as a conquered resource extraction platform. As a peer. As a trading partner. And this was the part that Tanaka had insisted on including and that several council members had initially considered too audacious, a military ally for the collective's conflicts with the three other spacefaring empires currently pressing against Vorith borders, conflicts that the Vorith had been managing with increasing difficulty for the past century and that humanity's intelligence teams had spent years analyzing in careful detail. Crothwell listened to Esperanza Vidal speak in his own language from a cross-legged position on the floor of his flagship's corridor, in the red emergency light, surrounded by his guard who were looking at this small human with expressions that his species used to convey profound confusion, and he was quiet for a long moment after she finished. Then he asked her one question. He asked how long humanity had known about the collective's border conflicts. Vidal told him honestly. 7 years of data collection, 4 years of detailed analysis. Crothwell was quiet again for longer this time. Then he told his guard to stand down, and he walked forward through their formation toward the human captain, and he stopped 3 meters in front of her and looked at her with the compound eyes of a species that had looked down at 437 worlds from orbit and seen only resources, and he said something that his translator rendered with somewhat awkward literalness but whose meaning was absolutely clear. He said that he wanted to understand how it was possible that a species had known about the collective strategic vulnerabilities for 4 years and had chosen to keep that information as a negotiating position rather than as a weapon. Vidal told him that humans had found, over a very long and frequently painful history, that information used as a bridge tended to build something more durable than information used as a hammer. Crothwell considered this for 11 seconds, which Vidal's team later noted was apparently a significant duration for a Vorith commander to spend in visible contemplation. Then he said that he would transmit the communication to High Command. Then he said, and this was the part that Vidal included in her operational report with a notation that she was not entirely sure how to classify it, that the collective had surveyed 438 civilizations now, and that this one was the first one he was glad had not surrendered. The next 72 hours were the most complex diplomatic operation in human history, conducted simultaneously in orbit above Earth, in the Geneva bunker, in the United Earth Council chambers, and via the long-range communication systems of 18 captured Vorith vessels whose crews were being treated with scrupulous care by boarding teams who understood that how humanity treated prisoners was going to matter enormously in every conversation that followed. Chinwei managed the orbital component. Okafor managed the security architecture of the ongoing Vorith crew containment, which was less containment and more a careful, structured process of demonstrated good faith conducted under the watchful attention of people who were still very much prepared for things to go badly if they did. Tanaka managed the technology negotiation because there was a technology negotiation, because one of the things humanity had determined was non-negotiable was access to the Vorith faster-than-light drive system, which would be the subject of extensive technical exchange in the months that followed. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, a message arrived from the Vorith Collective High Command that had traveled across interstellar distances at speeds humanity was about to learn to replicate, and that message contained something that none of the planning documents, none of the strategic analyses, none of the 11 years of preparation had quite managed to anticipate. The High Command, reviewing Crothwell's transmission and the accompanying sensor data that showed 398 dark ships and 44 human vessels moving through them like they owned the space, had convened an emergency session of the collective's governing body, its first emergency session in 240 years. The result of that session was a communication that Tanaka read 4 times before she trusted her translation software enough to bring it to Chinwei. What the Vorith High Command said, in formal collective diplomatic register, was that they were dispatching a diplomatic mission to Earth. Not a military mission. Not another fleet. A diplomatic mission with full negotiating authority, to discuss the terms of a relationship between the Vorith Collective and the civilization of Earth that would be, in the High Command specific phrasing, mutually defined rather than unilaterally imposed. They included, as a gesture of good faith that Tanaka flagged as extraordinary by any measure of Vorith diplomatic history, a full star map of collective space and a preliminary data package on the 3 border conflicts they were currently engaged in, offered as a demonstration that they understood humanity had already obtained this information and that they chose transparency over the pretense of advantage. Chinwei read the communication, looked up at the star map that now filled the main display of the Geneva bunker, and thought about 438 civilizations. She thought about all the ones that had looked up at Vorath ships and made the rational choice. She thought about what it meant that the 438th had instead spent 11 years building something extraordinary in secret and then sat cross-legged on the floor of an alien flagship and offered a bridge instead of a hammer. She thought about everything that came next, the diplomatic mission, the technology exchange, the conversations that would need to happen about the border conflicts, the slow and complicated and probably frequently frustrating process of 2 very different civilizations trying to build something that worked for both of them. She thought about the 44 ships still in orbit, and the 18 captured vessels, and the grandfather paradox humming quietly in its 17 locations, and Dr. Tanaka who had been awake for 53 hours and would probably be awake for another 20 before she let anyone persuade her to sleep. She thought about Marcus Okafor saying there they are in the silence after 398 ships went dark. She thought about Esperanza Vidal sitting cross-legged on the floor of an alien flagship and speaking a language she had spent 11 years learning for exactly that moment. Then Chinwei looked at the star map, all those stars, all that space, all that possibility spreading out in every direction from their small blue world, and she allowed herself a third smile. Not tight this time. Not controlled. A real one, the kind that reaches everything and doesn't apologize for itself. Because the Vorath had come to Earth expecting to add a 438th world to their collection, and what they had found instead was something their 3,000 years of empire building had never once prepared them for. They had found a species that refused to be collected. A species that had looked at an extinction-level threat and responded with music and laughter and 11 years of meticulous, magnificent preparation. A species that had won not by becoming something greater than itself but by being, completely and without apology, exactly what it already was. Humanity had not just defended Earth. In the span of 72 hours, it had taken 18 Vorath warships, forced the first emergency session of the collective's governing body in 240 years, opened the door to faster-than-light travel, and positioned itself as a potential peer power in a galactic political landscape it had not even known existed a week ago. The Vorath had come to take an empire's newest subject world. They were leaving having encountered something they had no category for and would spend a long time trying to understand. They were leaving having met, for the first time in 438 attempts, a civilization that looked at the most powerful empire in the known galaxy and decided, with complete seriousness and not a single moment of genuine doubt, that it could do better. 8 billion humans looked up at the sky as the Vorath fleet, restored to partial power by a careful and deliberate partial withdrawal of the grandfather paradox field, began its slow withdrawal from Earth orbit. They watched those enormous ships turn and recede, growing smaller against the stars, the bioluminescent markings on their hulls still pulsing in their rhythmic patterns, no longer reading as laughter to the scientists monitoring them. What they were reading now, according to Derek Tun's analysis, filed from the departing flagship in one of his characteristically precise reports, was something closer to the Vorath equivalent of reassessment. The ships grew smaller and then were gone, slipping back into faster-than-light travel and the vast dark between the stars, carrying with them something that would spread through the collective faster than any official communication. A story, a new story about the 438th world, the one that had not surrendered, the one that had sat on the floor and offered a bridge, the one that was coming, ready or not, out into the galaxy that had come to claim it. The stars waited as they always had. But they were waiting for something different now. They were waiting to see what humanity would do next. And if the previous 72 hours were any indication, whatever it was going to be worth watching. The end.